I've been to Canada to eat Nando's.
You like those people that go across the border to get free healthcare?
Yeah, I'm reversed. The Canadians come to the US for healthcare, and I go there for halal chicken.
You know, I was 16 when 9/11 happened. My feeling immediately was, if they come for one of us, they're going to come for all of us. They're not going to split hairs, those people. They're not going to go, oh, sorry, you're a Hindu, I'm so sorry.
You always need the good old far right to remind us what unites us is much more than what divides us as brown and black folks.
I think Rishi Sunak in many ways is like quite a tragic figure. As tragic a figure as it's possible to be when your net worth is in the region of £700 million.
Yes, and you were Prime Minister of the country.
Yeah. They were race riots. There's no point in calling them by any other name.
How bad was it? If you look at your life in the UK, how did August feel?
It felt the worst it's ever felt.
Wow.
This was a different level. I've never been afraid to walk around in the United Kingdom. When I was a kid, all I used to do is watch like The Simpsons and Chris Rock and Goodness Gracious Me. Yeah, Goodness Gracious Me is like British Asian, South Asian sketch show.
I still, to this day, my wife's American. We still, even now, if there's an inappropriate scene on television, we say, this doll is fantastic, to get our kids to not watch. I'm Mehdi Hasan.
And I'm Nish Kumar.
And we're not kidding. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Such a pleasure to have you.
Wait, welcome to my show. I believe I'm hosting this,
That's
maybe.
true. You're the guest host this week. It's not Pod Save the UK, to be clear. Let's just get our podcasts right? I know you already have this big glamorous show here in London. When I knew I was going to be back in London again, the team and I thought you were the man to sit around with.
Sure.
There's a lot to discuss. You have been killing it here in the UK on the comedy scene, podcast scene, crooked media empire scene. And there's a lot to talk about. And before we get into, and the viewers and listeners know, there's a lot of deep stuff that we talk about on this show. We like to get serious with funny people. That's the purpose of the podcast. But just to get personal first, I like to do my homework. I was reading, interviews of yours, biographies of yours, and every time I read something about you, it comes back to one place. It comes back to a place called Nando's. I love Nando's, Nish. I love it. I'm going tomorrow.
How does it feel being in exile from true Nando's? I know they have Nando's in America.
And the other problem is I'm Muslim. I eat halal food only.
Yeah.
And it's not halal, the Nando's. Not a single Nando's in the United States. In Canada it is. I've been to Canada to eat Nando's. But in the US...
You're like those people that go across the border to get free healthcare.
Yeah, I'm reversed. The Canadians come to the US for healthcare, and I go there for halal chicken and peri-peri.
I mean, I don't know how many of the decision makers at the head office at Nando's are listening to this.
I don't know. Do I get a black card or gold? Remember there's that famous card that there was rumours that people had?
Yeah.
I bet you have one.
No, I don't have one.
No, we're not in that. We'll know we've made it when we get one.
But also, they would not give me a black card. A black card gives you free unlimited Nando's.
You would bankrupt them.
It would genuinely... I think when I leave the country, it shows up on their bottom line. I think when I leave the country, Nando's UK is like, hold on a second, we've got a lot
affected.
So got a lot more
for
chicken.
those of our viewers, listeners who are in the US who maybe don't get the Nando's craze in the UK, which has become part of our language, right? They get a cheeky Nando's.
Cheeky Nando's.
You said in a Guardian interview recently, Nando's is the only thing uniting this increasingly fragmented nation. What did you mean by that? Break it down for the global audience watching today's We're Not Kidding. Very important.
It's just, Britain, as many of the countries around the world has become quite a fragmented place politically. There's a sense that, sections of the country are occupying almost different realities from each other. But the one place we all come together is around Nando's. And Nando's is a chain, I believe, started by a South African that promises traditional Portuguese chicken. So this really...
In the UK.
In the UK. This is the promise of the global Britain, maybe. This is a promise of global Britain. And it's basically spicy peri-peri chicken, and you can choose how spicy you want it. My level is extra hot. I'm not saying that to be macho. I'm Asian.
Wow.
You know what it's like. There's a certain level of genetic protection.
I'm medium.
Are you medium?
I am, to my shame.
Oh my God, you must get rinsed in the family WhatsApps.
I do. My cousins do hot. I don't know who does extra hot. That's bold.
I think I've eaten so much of it over the years that I think I've deadened some of my taste buds to it.
You're throwing out. You've already thrown out the desi brown Indian card already with the extra hot.
Correct.
Your parents are from India. Like
Correct.
Mine are from South India.
Where in South India?
Hyderabad.
Really?
Yeah. What about
I thought
you?
you were a North Indian guy. No, I'm Kerala.
Kerala.
Yeah.
Home of the fish curry.
Home of fish
All
curry,
fish.
Communism, and
the only
alcoholism that we don't talk about.
My dad used to tell me this. The only elected communist government in the world.
100%. 100% true. The state government of Kerala.
Still today?
Yeah. The state government of Kerala is, it has been an elected
like a real communist, not like a Kamala Harris communist in the eyes of Donald Trump.
No.
She's a communist. Not like Americans use communist for anyone who's vaguely centre left.
Yeah. I don't think we should burn the poor. Well, you must have been reading Karl Marx this morning. Like that, not that level of literal communist. And also the bit of Kerala that I'm from, the specific caste background that I'm from, actually operates a matrilineal system of inheritance. So your everything, including your surname, comes through your mother's family. So it's a part of India.
Kumar is from your mother's family?
No. That's a made up surname.
What does that mean?
My dad made up a surname on UK immigration paperwork.
Why didn't he go with Smith?
If
you're going to make up a name as an immigrant, why make up another Indian one? That doesn't make any sense.
You're now asking a question I've been asking for 39 years. Well, not 39.
You could have been Nat Smith.
He thought our name is supposed to be either Nair or Nambia.
Your original
name. And for some reason he thought...
I know lots of Nairs.
Yeah, for some reason he thought British people wouldn't be able to pronounce it.
Apart from the people who give awards to Mira Nair.
Yeah, exactly. Mira Nair, very famous filmmaker.
Yeah.
I don't know why my dad did this, but he picked Kumar, which is a very traditional North Indian. It's like somebody...
Great TV show, Kumar's at number 42. Back in the day we used to watch that.
Yeah. It's like somebody being called MacDonald and someone going, well, you must be Scottish. And you're going, no.
No, that's weird.
No, it's really weird.
My
dad's a weird guy.
I mean... My dad's a weird guy. I say that with respect to my dad. As a Muslim, you're not supposed to insult your parents. I say that in a very positive sense, but all of our Indian fathers are eccentric in their own ways. Indian immigrant fathers. I think that's fair to say. One quick thing on the food before we get on to, I promise we're about to talk some politics, but on the food front, is it true your grandfather ran an Indian restaurant?
Yeah, in Leicester.
That's amazing.
My grandfather...
So is that where you ate extra hot food as well as a kid?
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
But that's amazing. I've always dreamt what it'd be like to have an Indian restaurant in the family.
But just before we get off Nando's, we got sidetracked. And I would just say, whoever's making the decisions in American Nando's, if you are not making Nando's halal, you are cutting off a huge part of the natural demographic.
It's insane.
My parents refused to eat fast food. And then when they went to Nando's, my dad was like, oh my God, I can taste this.
I know.
This is unbelievable. There is a whole...
My parents love it too, but my dad objects to the size of the chicken. Why is it such a classic? Why is it such a big piece? Should we cut into? It's from India, smaller. It's just an objection he has, but he loves the food. But so Indian restaurant in the family, that must have been amazing.
Indian restaurant in the family.
Did you work at the restaurant? Were you in the back?
No, so by the time I was about 7 or 8 years old, so my granddad, we were in Leicester, which is in a city kind of in the middle of England. Confusingly, it's called the Midlands, but it's not in the middle of the UK, which is something that often trips up Americans. But it's in the middle of England, and it was a big population centre of the South Asian population. And so my grandparents moved there when my mum was about 14, 15. And they came, like a lot of people, via East Africa, so they were from Kenya. And so they were in Leicester, and my grandfather started started an Indian restaurant there, and he had one Indian restaurant, another Indian restaurant, and then he ran a greasy spoon, English cafe, which
baked beans, everything.
To me is the true mark of integration. He went the full circle. What's your family's immigration background?
So my dad came from Hyderabad, India in 1966, February, year of the World Cup victory.
Wow.
And my mum came in the 70s. So I've been here a while.
Hyderabad biryani is very fun.
The greatest
I swear to God, we will talk about something else.
The greatest biryani in the world.
Indians are very territorial about their biryani.
Yes.
And
Hyderabadi biryani wins.
Because it's got the baked bread over the top of it.
Not just that. It's the way it's made. And
I
don't cook. Sadly, I'm ashamed to say. I like to eat a lot of food I can't cook to save my life.
My dad would obviously have physically attacked you because to him, Calicut is the Kerala biryani.
It's not the same.
Biryani is it's Indians are so unbelievably territorial about it, and that's something that's been passed down even to the second generation. Look how quickly you immediately said, and look how quickly I've represented an alternative.
We'll go outside to that street that I see there, and we will take this straight outside, and some white guy walking down the street said, "What are you fighting about?" And we'll say, "Biryani." F you. Nish, I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked a lot of comedians, especially brown and black comedians on this show. We had talked about calling We're Not Kidding, We Should Have Been Doctors was going to be the alternative title for the show.
Surely not you.
My mother's a doctor. She's very disappointed I'm a journalist. She is. I'm going to go see her tonight for dinner, and she's going to bring up again the fact that, really, did you really want to go down this line of work?
Really?
Yeah, my mother's a doctor, my father's an engineer. You cannot get more caricatured Indian couple, and their son's a journalist. My dad's over it. My dad's actually quite proud of my journalism. My mum still thinks I should have been at least an accountant or a lawyer. She's always like, you like to argue, you could have been a lawyer. And I'm like, true, I could have been a lawyer. Did you ever get that pressure from your parents?
Oh my God. Like, I almost hate to talk about it.
Dr. Kumar?
I always hate to talk about it because you're like, the problem with some stereotypes is they are true. And my mum would often say to me, like, when I was like 17, 18, my mum was like, you'd be a good doctor. Now, at the time, the way the UK education system works is you have to study a lot of subjects till 16, and then you pick 4 or 5. These are the subjects I was studying: English, history, French, and German.
And at that point, she's still holding out the candle for medicine.
Yeah, I can say to you in French, I'm sorry, I left my scissors in you. Like, that's like it was so insane.
Okay, but let me flip it. But you didn't become a doctor. You went the other extreme, became a stand-up comedian. Were they family fine with that?
They were absolutely perplexed by it. Like, they were totally confused by it. I think that they had which I think is a failure on their part, because when I was a kid, all I used to do is watch like The Simpsons and Chris Rock and Goodness Gracious Me. Yeah, Goodness Gracious Me is like, it's a British South Asian sketch show that like is the reason now there's so many, the preponderance of British Asian stand-up comedians, me, Ramesh Ranganathan, Ahir Shah, Sindhu's Indian who then moved here, but again, even like someone like Sindhu, the reason that all of us do this is because of Goodness Gracious Me, because it was, it was like this thing where I was, whatever it was, 12 years old. You saw them on TV and you thought, well, I can do that. And also,
I still, to this day, my wife's American, brown American, who moved to the UK for a decade and watched it with me. We still, even now, if there's an inappropriate scene on television, we say, this doll is fantastic, to get our kids to not watch. You mentioned Leicester. I wanted to talk about riots and British politics and what's going on in the UK right now, especially over the summer. I was last here in July. A lot's happened since July. But before I get to that, you mentioned Leicester.
Yeah.
Leicester is a place, when I was growing up, which was a cool place. I grew up in North London, but I had friends in Leicester. Leicester was a place where... No, I grew up in Harrow.
Harrow, right.
Not far from Wembley.
Yeah.
But Leicester was a place, and for the people who don't know Leicester, Hindus, Muslims, a lot of them. It's a place where Hindus, sorry to sound like some cliched ad, got along.
Yeah.
Hindus, Muslims, quite a nice place. No major racial tensions when I was growing up, at least in the 90s. In recent years, there have been tensions, unfortunately. So separate to the kind of, before we get to the riots and what's going on with the far right, and you're Hindu, I'm Muslim. Leicester, what's going on in Leicester?
I think like this sort of the pernicious wider influence of Modiism and the BJP and what effect that's having on the diaspora, I think is really, really interesting. So you've got this Hindu nationalist leader in India. So for someone like my dad, I want to ask you about this in conjunction with the riots when we come back to the sort of stuff that happened in August more generally, because I'm always fascinated by looking at someone like my dad. Like, my mum came here via East Africa. Her Indianness is sort of part of her, but not in the same way. My parents met here. So my dad moved here when he was 30. So he's like, he's Indian. And I think for him, there's like a sadness to him when he looks at India now, because to him, he's like, he was born in the 50s I actually corrected it. I was about to give you his year of birth and he'd be like, don't give my year of birth away. But he's to him, he's born into the like Nehruvian dream of India, this idea of the secular constitution, the freedom to practice whatever your religious belief is. Like, he's Jawaharlal Nehru is his like his guy. That's his person. Like,
same with my dad.
100%. That generation of people came up in India and they were growing up in reaction to what had just happened and partition, and they'd grown up in kind of escalating tensions between Hindus and Muslims, which it would be remiss of me to not mention was fostered and encouraged by the British Raj as a way
from this city.
Yeah, from this city, directly from this city. So that is something that is a tension that was manufactured, and so for my dad, I think I watch him watching like all these like ex-NDTV anchors that are now having to do YouTube channels. Like I watched While We Watched, which is a documentary about Rishi Kumar.
Oh yeah, fantastic.
And it was absolutely brilliant. And what shocked me being in, because I went to a screening of it that they were doing like as a preview screening. What shocked me was the number of British journalists that came out of that screening and said, we had no idea what was going on in India. We had no idea.
Even fewer American journalists, I think, have a clue of what's going on in India. And it's sad what's happened to the last independent bastions of media like NDTV. And it's sad that this stuff goes out into the diaspora.
But it goes out via WhatsApp groups. So it goes out via...
Thank you, Mark Zuckerberg, for your role in ethno-nationalism.
Modi and Bolsonaro, that the movements that sprung up around those two particular extremists were movements that very quickly established that like WhatsApp groups were a good way of disseminating misinformation. And so that has spread, that kind of hostility spread into the diaspora. You know, when we were growing up, you know, the Hindu-Muslim tensions were not really a big part of our generation's life. You know, like my grandfather's generation that lived through partition had some feelings about it. My dad's generation that are like the Nehruvian, the children of Nehru, the Midnight's Children, like the Salman Rushdie novel, that vision of India is their version of India. So now we've got this version of India which is, you know, actively trying to repress minority rights, you know, trying to change bits of the constitution to make India officially a Hindu country, which it is not. You know, it constitutionally it is a secular democracy, and that tension I think is spilled out into the WhatsApp groups. And
there was also, I mean, even pre-Modi though, and post 9/11, and I know 9/11. You're not Muslim, but as a brown British person,
fuck, man,
9/11 is a big formative moment for all of us. But what's interesting is after 9/11, I worked in the UK media. I was working in the UK media at the time of 9/11 as a young producer. And one thing I do remember is there was an open letter from like Hindu and Sikh communities saying like, why are you calling everyone Asian? We're not Asian. You guys, they're Muslim.
Yeah.
We're Asian. And I got it. There was a sense of it. I understood it, right? As much as I didn't agree with it, I understood this idea that like, all these Muslims did bad things. Why are we all getting roped in under this identity? And again, for the American viewers, Asian doesn't mean our brothers and sisters from China or Japan.
Yeah.
In the UK, we're talking subcontinent, talking Indo-Pak, Bangladeshi. And I remember thinking, you know, are we falling into the trap of the divide and rule, right? Again, 70 years later, why are we not sticking together? And that brings me, in my clunky way, to where we are today in 2024, where after these riots that we've seen in August, it's kind of like, we've gone back in time a bit.
Yeah.
But it's also a reminder of we're all stuck in this together, whether you like it or not. I'm pretty sure, and I saw a clip of you on Pod Save the UK at a public event talking about brown people feeling unsafe, talking about how we're going to get through this, talking about your own experience with you've had death threats and threats from racists for years. And I just thought to myself, it's just, you always need the good old far right to remind us that what unites us is much more than what divides us as brown and black folks.
I couldn't agree more. And you know, I was 16 when 9/11 happened, and my feeling immediately was they're not, if they come for one of us, they're going to come for all of us. Like, you know, that the fallacy that you can be the model minority. Even as a teenager, I didn't trust that. You know, because I was on the school bus having Osama shouted at me.
Yeah.
Like, and you know, they're not going to split hairs. Those people, they're not going to go, oh, sorry, you're a Hindu, I'm so sorry.
I always remind people, the first person killed in the United States of America after 9/11 in a hate crime was a Sikh man at a gas station in Arizona called Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was in a turban, and our white racist assumed he was bin Laden or a Muslim or whatever and killed him. Because in their eyes, you're just a turban brown dude. You're all the same.
The police killed a Brazilian man.
Yes.
The police killed Jean Charles de Menezes.
Yes.
Look, that name is burned in people like our brains.
2005.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Metropolitan
chased him
Police
onto the train.
Chased him onto a train because they thought he was a terror suspect. It turned out they were acting on nonsense intelligence. He was a Brazilian guy living in London. They chased him onto a train and they shot him on the train.
Right? I mean, this is the thing,
brown.
like we eat Brazilians, Hindus, Muslims. Ultimately, when shit hits the fan, we are all in that boat.
Absolutely, you know,
and it's sad that we need like terror attacks or riots to remind us.
And when you see, you know, there were these kind of there were these fights that broke out between Hindus and Muslims in Leicester. When you hear like, you know, anti-black racism from the South Asian community, from our community, when you hear, you know, you grow up around quite casualised anti-black racism. You think beyond just the obvious point, which is any form of racism is unacceptable. You also think, you fools, do you honestly think that they won't come for you next? And I always think that about, I think Rishi Sunak in many ways is like quite a tragic figure, as tragic a figure as it's possible to be when your net worth is in the region of £700 million.
Yes, and you were Prime Minister of the country.
Yeah. There's a moment where they realise a lot of these South Asian conservatives that have been very prominent in the Conservative Party in the UK for the last 5 years, where they realised that suddenly they were of no use to the white people whose essentially views they were enacting.
Yeah.
You know, there was a moment where Rishi Sunak went up against Liz Truss for leadership of the Conservative Party, and I despise Sunak, but at the same time, you know, Liz Truss was quite clearly a wrecking ball that was going to
unhinged wrecking
ball. Demolish the British economy. And the Conservative Party still opted for her. And there were so many Conservative voters that switched to the Reform Party because they said they couldn't support Rishi Sunak. Nigel Farage said that he didn't understand our customs and traditions, and that's why he left the D-Day celebrations. This is the same Nigel Farage who leads the Reform Party, the leader, the agitator of Brexit in this country, a kind of figurehead of the far right here, who also said, Suella Braverman, another South Asian within the Conservative Party, was advocating that the Conservative Party work closer with.
I'll always remember my friend Wajahat Ali did a debate with a Muslims for Trump guy back in 2016. There was a group called Muslims for Trump, and I remember they were live on CNN, and he said to him, I think his name was Sajid Tarai, if my memory serves me correctly. Take it out in the edit if it's wrong. And he goes, and I remember they did a debate. It's etched into my mind. And as the debate finished, Waj, they were on a split screen on CNN, and Waj said, "They'll never love you, Sajid. Come back to us. They'll never love you." And it was like, that's it. He nailed it. And it's like, and it's true. Sunak, you saw when Sunak got worked up about that Channel 4 recording of the Reform Party activists calling him the P word.
Yeah.
And he got really worked up. I was like, are you really surprised? I couldn't work out if it was performative or real, but are you really surprised? This is what they think of you behind closed doors, your fellow right-wing white people. Vivek Ramaswamy, who ran for president in the United States, who I've had a bit of a back and forth, who came on my show. He went on Ann Coulter's podcast, or Ann Coulter came on his podcast, I can't remember which one, and she said, I loved your position. Ann Coulter, perhaps one of the most far-right journalists in the United States, she said, you were my favourite candidate in the race, but I can't vote for you because you're Indian.
Yeah.
Said it to his face. And he just nodded. And I was like, wow, quiet part loud. I mean, there you go.
Vivek's whole vibe was like, someone was making a South Asian remake of American Psycho, and he was putting himself forward as a Patrick Bateman character. But it was, I saw that. I saw that
when I next see him. I'll have to use that analogy.
But I saw that Coulter interview, and I remember thinking, like, will you ever understand this? I don't know.
His wife was in, I think, Iowa the day of the Iowa caucus. Again, not sure. One of the states, there was a primary at Iowa, and his wife, Vivek's wife, was meeting like voters, and they all said, again, we love you. Your husband's positions are amazing, but we can't vote for you because of your name. Because of your name. It's just blunt. And I think the bluntness of US racism is now manifesting itself. You know what? The UK always catches up with the US quite quickly with whatever trend. And what I'm seeing from afar, and this is why I want to talk to you, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that bluntness is now back here in the UK if it ever went away.
Yeah.
And not just the riots, but of course the political and media enablers of the riots.
Yeah. You know, there's been so much sort of unacknowledged racism in this country in this century. So in 2010, David Cameron becomes Prime Minister. We're in the midst of the global financial crisis. He and his Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, try and cut their way out of that recession.
Austerity.
Which has never, anyone who knows anything about economics. I was talking to someone, I met a couple of these younger people the other day that are friends of my friend, and they were saying, this kid was saying that he was at school in 2010, and his economics teacher basically said, I don't know how to teach you anymore, because the Chancellor of the Exchequer has proposed...
Defied economics.
Yeah, and has basically proposed something that I would fail an A-level student for doing. And he... For presenting hypothetically his budget, I would fail his budget as an A-level economics paper. And so obviously when stuff like that happens and you have an economic downturn and you have an attempt to cut your way out of an economic downturn that sees a recession in state services, that then becomes a force multiplier on existing racism. But the racism was always there. There are so many restrictions and things you can't say on our national broadcaster, the BBC. There are so many legal things that you can't accuse people of. There's so many hoops you have to jump through. One that you don't have to jump through is describing Boris Johnson as a racist. That is allowed on the BBC because he has used racist terminology to describe people of colour, specifically a term like an arcane term. Yeah, that's it. It's an arcane term for black people.
Only Boris could do arcane racism.
This is the thing. But I think he thought he was being clever. I think he thought he'd got a workaround, but it wasn't. It was unambiguous racism, and you're allowed...
He also did, of course, letterboxes, women in burqas looking like letterboxes, which led to a rise in hate and crime attacks on Muslim women.
Absolutely, and he still became prime minister. You know, that remarks that you would think would preclude him from becoming prime minister did not preclude him from becoming prime minister. So you have this kind of unacknowledged racism that then gets accelerated by the impacts of austerity. That's always going to happen. Any economic downturn means that people are going to...
UK culture wars, we talk about in the US culture wars, is the UK having culture wars? Is that what led partly to these riots?
I think America is a problem for the UK. Because, and especially in terms of the racism and hostility to immigrants that exists in the media, because Fox News is so theatrical in the way that it, spreads misinformation and in the way that it spreads like hostility towards immigrants and immigrant groups. I think there's I genuinely think there's a section of sensible British society that looks at Fox News and thinks we're not as bad as them. But if you actually look at the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and the Sun and the op-eds that have been published in the Telegraph and like newspapers like the Times that have incredible investigative journalists working for them that have done incredible work in the last few years, but whose opinion pages are often filled with kind of anti-immigrant bile, you do start to wonder. You know, there's a columnist in this country who still writes in newspapers who was cited approvingly in Anders Breivik's manifesto, before he committed a mass shooting. And there's been so much amping up of rhetoric through the last 14 years, and especially in and around the time of Brexit. At one point when the legal process in this country was kind of stymieing the process of Brexiting, of us leaving the European Union. And the reason it was being stymied was because the people who were agitated for it didn't really have a clue of how to actually do it. So they were running into legal roadblocks. It wasn't because the judges were being activists. They were just interpreting the law correctly. They were called enemies of the people in the Daily Mail.
Yes.
Judges were called enemies of the people.
Which is a very Trumpy phrase.
Incredibly. I guess maybe I'm almost becoming defensive and going, you know what, actually... we're not imitating the US. The US is imitating us.
In some ways. I mean, normally Britain is always playing catch-up with the US politically, economically, culturally. But, I mean, look, touch wood, we haven't had the kind of riots in the US that the UK saw in August. What happened here in the UK? Nish? How did it start? How bad was it?
Every element of this is a horrible story. So it starts with a stabbing where children were murdered in a town called Southport in the northwest of England. What then happened after that is a lot of misinformation started to flood social media. I mean, this will be a story familiar to Americans as well and people all over the world, to be honest. But as soon as that story, they didn't release the name of the suspect. Now, the reason they didn't release the name of the suspect is because the suspect was under 18, and there are laws around reporting in these cases, even if the suspect is under 18. So the police at the time were following the police and the broadcast media were following laws that are put in place for a reason, child protection laws, essentially. And so they didn't release the name of the suspect. Now, it transpired that this suspect was a British citizen, was born in this country, was a British citizen. The social media sort of misinformation bin fire then started to churn out this conspiracy theory that the suspect was a refugee or an asylum seeker.
Muslim on a boat.
Exactly. So now
there's a big controversy about immigrants coming in on small boats.
Yes. So the last election in 2019, the Conservative Party slogan, one of the key slogans was "Stop the Boat." So there are boats that come across the Channel from France with refugees and asylum seekers. I was informed by Zoe Gardner, who is a migration expert, on the last episode of Pod Save the UK, that boat crossings account for about 5% of the total people that come to this country. It could not be closer to the migrant caravans conspiracy theory that Trump tried to propagate. It's an issue that's been blown all out of proportion by the Conservative Party, but also by, the Conservative press in this country. So you have this situation where the sort of conspiracy theorists of Twitter are saying that the reason that they've not released the name is because it's an asylum seeker or refugee. Nigel Farage then, in my view, fanned the flames of that by making some very, very open-ended statements about the issue and implying that we were being lied to for a nefarious purpose.
Boosted from across the Atlantic by the owner of Twitter, of course, Elon Musk.
Yeah. So
platformed a lot of these people.
The owner of
Tommy
Twitter,
Robinsons were platformed by Twitter.
And Elon Musk starts helping to propagate those theories and helping to propagate the conspiracy that this is part of some kind of... anyway, it was all nonsense. But by then the sort of damage was done, and it led to a string of riots happening across England and Northern Ireland, and they were full on. They were race riots. There's no point in calling them by any other name.
They were targeting people on the basis, not
they were
just of their
targeting people
religion,
on the basis
but
of
just
ethnic-
brown folks.
There are hotels that the government uses to house asylum seekers that are waiting to be processed. Now, anyone who knows anything about that issue will tell you that is because of the opacity of the application system that keeps people locked in there. But the right-wing press stirs this up and saying, look, we're paying for them to be in hotels.
And people targeted the hotels.
Yeah, people targeted the hotels.
And they targeted mosques.
They targeted hotels. They targeted mosques. There was footage of... And listen, there was footage. This actually happened to a friend of mine. People were driving through UK towns, and mobs of racists were essentially trying to open car doors to pull people out into the street. Wow. People were physically attacked in the street. It was horrific.
So 2 questions to you from me. One is, you grew up in South London, I believe. I grew up in North London.
Yeah.
Obviously, 80s. Are you 80s child? I don't want to date you too much.
Born in 85.
So you're a bit younger than me. But compared to growing up in South London, or me in North London, we had the P word and the racism, and you had, in the early 80s, you had kind of Combat 18 and some of the BNP type groups. Yeah. But how bad was it? If you look at your life in the UK, how did August feel?
It felt the worst it's ever felt.
Wow.
It felt the worst it's ever felt in my life. And again, I would also say, for someone like me, there was definitely street level racism, P word being shouted at you, and then also the spectre of the British National Party and this, which is a far right party that was running in elections, and there were street protests in parts of East London and Essex against their candidates. But this was a different level. I've never been afraid to walk around in the United Kingdom. I've never had that fear. And my job since 2008 really has been traveling around the United Kingdom and Ireland
as a stand-up comedian
and traveling everywhere. And honestly, it doesn't occur to me that there were certainly places where I would meet. I would be on guard, and I would be maybe a little bit more.
Because you've had death threats before. You've talked about.
Yeah. So then, so this is then in 2019. I mean, the kind of brief backstory. Please go to nishkumar.co.uk and download my stand-up special, Your Power, Your Control, which has an 80-minute account of this story. But I presented a television program in the UK called The MASH Report, which was a kind of
like a Daily Show type.
Yeah, it was a UK attempt to do something like The Daily Show or Saturday Night Live, like a weekly topical comedy thing, and it attracted a lot of hostility in the press. A lot of people really loved the show, which is very nice.
The right-wing press didn't like it.
The right-wing press didn't like it. They felt that as a, state broadcaster, publicly funded broadcaster, it compromised the BBC's impartiality, which again, I would remind people, the BBC's impartiality commitment is in its news output. It's not required to be comedically impartial. But yes, so there was a lot of kind of general foaming at the mouth. And then in the lead up into the 2019 election, I did a kind of charity event that went badly and then briefly ended up with me being in sort of all the front pages of all of these newspapers. And then I received a sort of string of... I received a couple of very specific death threats. So I've seen an ugly side to Britain. And I've known the whole time that, a country that elected Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, and a country that continued to vote for Brexit, even after whatever you feel about the mechanics of Britain's membership of the European Union, in the lead up to the Brexit vote, a member of Parliament, a politician, was murdered by a far-right assassin. Joe Cox, who was, a Labour MP, an open advocate for remaining in the European Union, but also for refugee rights. She was killed in the street by a man who, in court, when asked to give his name, gave his name as Freedom for Britain. So she was murdered by a hard right assassin.
So it was always there.
So it's always
been on the rise, but
it's
August,
been there, and
you're saying August
was
the worst.
But August was the worst. August was the first time in my life where I felt afraid to be a person of colour in the street in Britain.
And forgive me for asking this question, because obviously I came at it watching it from afar, hearing from Muslim friends and family, looking at what happened to the mosque in Southport that I believe was surrounded by a mob. People, worshippers, and thought they were going to die. I'm going to ask the question I asked at the beginning, which is about kind of divide and rule. Hindus are watching this happening. They're not saying this is about Muslims. They're saying this is all of us.
This is all of us. Like, this was all of us. I mean, for the Muslim community particularly, it must have been, I know it was terrifying, because I know there were people saying, should I, wear hijab in the street, which is terrifying. And also, there were people calling the police, and the police essentially advising them to not go out of the house. Like that, I know for a fact that happened in this country. And so my sort of issue with it is that everybody is sort of, the conversation, the national conversation has sort of moved on from it without any actual audit of what happened. And I'll tell you what, the most dangerous thing is to not have a proper audit about what happened. And that's a huge part of what's happened in America. The guy running for president tried to overthrow the government. Like, he fight like hell were the words that he used. And a mob of his supporters broke into the Capitol building. And I think the problem is...
we all just moved on, which allowed him to then run again.
But also the problem is that we all focused on the guy with the bear on his head. But I saw a photograph, that was from January the 6th of a guy with his face covered with a gun and cable ties. That's the guy you should be talking about. That's the guy we should all be worried about, because that guy didn't go there to like rub shit on the walls or anything. He went there to murder.
Yeah, and the gallows.
Yeah, they went there to kill.
But you make a good point about the moving on and the lack of it. Certainly, Trump would not be able to run for president right now if there had been accountability.
If there had been an honest conversation.
Instead we just buried it. The Democrats helped bury it. Obviously, in America, Pod Save America is very well known, covering the Democratic Party. You are the co-host of Pod Save the UK. Let me then make the segue to say, audit in the UK, Labour government in the UK. This happens a month after a new Labour government is sworn in. Sir Keir Starmer, for a lot of our viewers and listeners, Prime Minister of the UK, Labour Prime Minister. During the riots, he was attacked by some on the left and in Muslim communities for not calling this Islamophobia, for not calling it anti-Muslim racism. Labour MP, who's now suspended, Zara Sultana, who came on Mehdi Unfiltered, one of our other shows recently, she went on Good Morning Britain and got pilloried by the hosts because they said, well, why do you care if it's Islamophobia or not? How do you think Labour handled this?
I think that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party missed a moment to show leadership. Listen, I still believe the majority of people in this country are not racist, but I think, and that, the majority of Americans don't support Donald Trump. We know that from all available election data. The Republican Party is winning these elections because of a badly compromised Democratic process.
They don't have the popular vote.
They don't have the popular vote. And I believe the majority of people in the UK are not racist, but I do believe that that's not enough as a conversation. To say the majority of people in this country are not racist, and then you move on, because you're still emboldening and empowering that, however voluble a minority is. And also it's a voluble minority that has a lot of sympathetic voices within the press in this country. And I think that Starmer missed a moment to show national leadership, to say that Britain as a country angrily denounces any form of hostility towards minority communities. And the riots in this country were not any expression of legitimate grievance. They were an expression of racist hatred stirred up by bad actors and propagators of misinformation on the internet. That was what the Prime Minister of this country needed to say.
And it didn't come out of nowhere, right?
No,
it
didn't come out of nowhere.
Built on years of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment. That was fan the flames. The flames have to be there.
Everybody's acting like it was like, it was a bit hot in the summer and there's lots of cheap cocaine on the street. Like, that's sort of what people are talking about.
And then you get the highbrow right-wing intellectuals like, well, we need to look at the grievance. I'm like, you're the same people who spent 20 years telling people like me after 9/11 and 7/7, no root causes discussion.
No root cause discussion.
You're not allowed explanation. You're justifying the attacks. You're an apologist for terrorism. But suddenly a bunch of white people on the right go nuts and violent. Well, we need to hear them out.
Yeah, we need to hear them out. We need to hear their legitimate
concerns.
That's the phrase. I don't know how common it is in the press and political conversations outside of the UK, but in the UK, the phrase legitimate concerns is constantly used.
David Cameron used it a lot.
It's constantly used to justify pandering to racists, essentially. But I want to ask you...
And I wait for a day when a mainstream politician says, actually, no, they're not legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
They're racist. But even politicians on the left feel they must cater to white working class communities. Even a Bernie Sanders in the US will always say, well, they're worried about wages. And it's actually, they're not really. They're worried about the browning of their country.
Also, when you focus on the white working class, again, you're dividing and ruling. The white working class has much more in common with the ethnic minority working class than they do with Donald Trump or they do with Nigel Farage.
My favourite cartoon that did the rounds again after August was the Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah.
The Rupert with the cookies. He's got the pile of cookies. The white working class has one. He goes, look, that immigrant took all your cookies.
Yeah. There's a reason that always crops up because it sort of distills something into a very simple and direct image. But I wanted to ask you, again, just to go back to my dad watching India, what was it like for you in the summer being... I assume you were in the States while that was happening. What was it like watching that happen? As somebody that grew up here as a person of colour.
Yeah, it was depressing because, as I say, I grew up at a time when we looked at race riots as something from history, right? So I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, looking back at the 70s and 60s. And we did have, we had riots in 2011 in London when I was here. I left the UK in 2015 after a police shooting back in 2011. Those were pretty major. But as you say, to have race riots, old school, far right, let's attack brown people, let's, as you say, drag from the cars, that was pretty scary. Obviously, I was worried for family and friends. But for me, more than anything else, because I have skin in this game, right? A lot of people you mentioned are people who I've fought with, for a polite word. I spent a lot of time in the British media until I left in 2015 having these arguments about Daily Express front pages, about Islamophobia. I was the guy, sadly, who was the go-to Muslim guy when things happened in the UK. I would go on BBC panels, I would go on Channel 4 News, I would go on Sky newspaper reviews. So for me, I'm familiar with a lot of this crap that you're talking about, the legitimate concerns, the mainstream. So to see it all culminate here, it's almost like, well, I'm not surprised. What did you think would happen? And then to see Tommy Robinson crop up, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember him. I remember when the BBC was doing softball documentaries about Tommy Robinson. I remember when people were pretending that he was rehabilitated and de-radicalized. I remember I saw the clip of Douglas Murray doing the rounds from last year where he's, encouraging mobs to take matters into their own hands, which he was like, oh, this is edited out of context from way before the riots. Again, Douglas Murray, another character from my past, person I've debated with a lot. And for me, it was like, I'm not really surprised. Obviously, I'm shocked at the level of violence and hate, but I'm not surprised it happened because it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a mainstreaming of the worst tendencies. And I do lay the blame not at the kind of hot-headed young men in a summer of London, but at the Rupert Murdochs of this world and the Elon Musks of this world and the newspaper proprietors who have pushed this stuff. And the same in the US. I mean, if you want to make the analogy, like Rupert Murdoch, by the way, in both countries, has Fox in the US, has the Sun and the Times Empire here. That is fundamentally what's been going on for a long time, and we've let it go. Yeah. And you made a very good point just now, which is we've let it go again with a Labour government. There hasn't been a moment to stop and say, all right, we need to do things differently now. Yeah. Look what happened. Yeah. It's just going to happen again. I actually think it's going to get worse. You've got people, as you say now, justifying the riots. As we get further and further away from the August, I suspect you'll see more people try and rewrite history. It's what happened with the insurrection. Yeah. After January 6th, even Republicans were like, this is unacceptable. 3-4 years later, it's like, oh, it was a patriotic march. They've been misrepresented. They were good people. They were tourists. I think that's the same thing's going to happen with this. In a few months' time, even less time, people are going to rewrite it. It was an anti-immigrant protest, a few extremists on the fringe. And I think that's very, very dangerous because once you've uncorked this stuff, it doesn't go back in the bottle.
So you have, I would say what I have and what a few friends of mine have, that, especially friends of mine that have been trying to write about race and racism in the UK, which is a kind of wearied sense of, I sort of feel like a lot of people have been trying to warn you that something like this was going to happen. Yeah. And a lot of the same people that have been trying to warn, frontline politicians and prominent voices in the media that this stuff was coming are now also trying to warn them that if you don't have an honest audit of what actually happened in August, then it is going to happen again and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And I don't know. I there's a part of me that keeps saying, someone's going to get killed. People have been killed.
Yes.
And I don't know. I don't know what has to happen to force an
And I
honest
think,
conversation.
look, as someone who now has British and American citizenship, what worries me is I'm a citizen of two countries where people are in denial and pretending that the country is exceptional from
Yeah.
global trends.
Yeah.
So we are in the UK now, not far away. The Germans just elected a neo-Nazi linked party, the
Yeah.
AfD, in more than one state. And you go, well, that's the continental Europe. They've always had a Nazi problem, not us. I'm in the US where they say stuff like, well, we're not really going to have fascism. That's what happens in other countries. The system is strong here. We have guardrails. We have a Supreme Court. And I find myself telling Americans, no, you're not exceptional. We're not exceptional. Right. It can happen here. And then I find myself here in the UK saying, what direction do you think the UK is going in? It is going in a very far right. There's nothing that makes Britain immune from the European far right.
What you said is so important. It's so important that particularly Americans and British people understand that, like, this exceptionalism argument is going to drag all of us into the gutter. You know, and especially if we want to focus on the white working class. What has this racist politics delivered to them? In Britain, nothing. Stagnant wages, lower standard of living. Yep. It's delivered nothing. It's hugely damaging to white working class people in this country, the racist politics. But you have to understand that, like, the Trump, Farage, there is a continuum that takes in Trump, Farage, Bolsonaro, Modi, Netanyahu. This idea that we're exceptional, Orban, Putin, they're all part of a continuum. You know, they're all part of a continuum of an attempt to drag the global political conversation right back into the 1930s, I think.
We're running out of time, but you just mentioned a very important figure there that I did want to ask you about, Netanyahu. You have been quite vocal on Gaza as well, both as a podcaster and as a comedian and as someone speaking on this. You even pulled out of hay over Gaza. Why?
It was part of a Fossil Free Books campaign. So the Fossil Free Books campaign is also attempting to get companies that invest in literary festivals to divest from fossil fuels. And the one of the firms that's a big financer of all of these things had investments in fossil fuels and also had investments in companies linked to the Netanyahu government. And so I felt that whilst that was happening, it felt hypocritical of me to go up and work under that banner. But and the thing about the Fossil Free Books movement is it was actually effective because it did actually cause them to get rid of that sponsor. I think in terms of Gaza, I'm sort of, I'm 39 years old and I think I'm finally hit an age.
Rubbing it in.
Maybe I'm so young.
You're
I'm just
compared
so
to
young.
me.
But I think people my age have hit a point where millennials love to pretend we're the first group that anything has ever happened to.
Yes.
So I think that a lot of us are now pretending that we're the first group of people to ever notice that bad things keep happening cyclically. And I think for me, the thing that's shocking for me is that the October 7th, 9/11 parallels are absolutely overwhelming. And I think the thing that's surprising to me is a lot of people that were very, that came of age, essentially defined the way that they see global politics in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, are now struggling to make the same connections between what's going on in Gaza right now. Netanyahu is openly trying to change the Israeli constitution to essentially make his crimes lawful. Like this is a corrupt man, and this is a corrupt man who is essentially trying to hide his crimes behind a genocide. And
while the world watches.
While the world watches.
And just to come back to the Labour government that you're now covering for Pod Save the UK, David Lammy has a bunch of tweets up, the Foreign Minister of the UK, the Foreign Secretary, when he was in opposition, attacking Netanyahu, calling him out. First thing he did as Foreign Secretary is go out to Israel and hug him and shake his hand or whatever it is, greet with him and have a nice visit with him. He got attacked for it from the left, obviously. Lammy, Starmer, they've done a little bit in the sense that they've suspended some arms, a kind of minority. How do you think Labour's doing on the Middle East?
It's a very strange thing to be this age and see a Labour government having, at best, a poor policy towards a war in the Middle East, because I'm starting to think, is it 2004 again? Like,
Yeah.
what's going on? Like, is my virginity about to come back? Like, it's an astonishing sense of history repeating itself.
9/11, October 7th, Labour, Blair, Starmer.
Like, Keir Starmer has modelled himself on Tony Blair, and I'm worrying how closely.
Not just model. Blair's around. I see him
Blair's
doing
around.
interviews.
Blair's visible.
Which
And
gives me kind of creeps.
I'm pleased with the somewhat limited suspension of arms sales to Israel. I would like it to go further, and I would like the thing with Netanyahu, when the centre-left parties like the Labour Party or the Democrats speak supportively of him, he has absolutely no respect for them. He had absolutely no respect for the Democratic Party of America.
True.
He had no respect for Barack
humiliated Joe
Obama.
Biden for a year.
Humiliated Joe Biden for a
He
year.
humiliated Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
People, you have to go back. He's been around so long. People forget. He's been around through 3 Democratic presidents and has humiliated all of them, to the point where Clinton came out of a meeting with Netanyahu when he first met with him and turned to his aides and said, "Who the fuck is the superpower here?"
Yeah.
Right? That's how annoyed Clinton was when he first met him. Of course, Obama with the Iran deal.
Yeah.
And now Biden.
I've sat in a room with Ben Rhodes, who's one of the
Yes.
senior people at Crooked Media, who
Was
was
Deputy National Security Advisor to Obama.
absolutely, and you know, he said, and I'm not speaking out of turn here because he said it on record on our podcast. He said people who say that they support the actions of this Israeli government but also support a two-state solution are talking nonsense. He said, I've been in a room with Benjamin Netanyahu when he has said there will never be a two-state solution in the Middle East. You know, you have to look at who you're aligning yourself with. You have to think critically about who you're aligning yourself with. And also, you have to think, you have to learn from, I'm not even asking people to learn from ancient history. I'm asking people to learn from recent history. Ask yourself a question. Did the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan make the people in Iraq and Afghanistan safer?
Nish,
The US and
speaking my
America?
language, I feel like I want to sometimes bang my head on a wall. It's all been done before.
It's all been done before.
Not 100 years ago, 10 years ago, and we're doing it all again.
And now they're bombing Lebanon.
There's nothing you can't solve in the Middle East without a few more bombs, Nish. Haven't you heard?
It's just unbelievable. You know, for Rumsfeld and Cheney, Reid, Netanyahu, Itamar Ben-Gvir, like all of these people, these are...
We never learn.
They are hard right extremists.
Because I can't bring myself to end the show with a reference to Dick Cheney and Itamar Ben-Gvir. I'm going to say to you, Nish, where can people find you now? What's the tour you're doing? Give us a plug.
I'm doing a tour that is going all over the UK and to Dublin, and we're in the process of getting an American tour together.
Amazing. What's it called?
The show is called Nish Don't Kill My Vibe.
Okay.
And which is a reference to a Kendrick Lamar song, and is also a reference to the fact that it's a stand-up comedy show about a string of the least funny subjects possible. I mean, there's a bit in the show where I talk about a genuine comment a friend of mine gave me from one of his friends, which was, why doesn't he do some jokes about the things in his fridge? And then I read out the set list for the second half of the show, and the second half of the show is Gaza, art, radicalization, death, anxiety, rage. That is the set list, and I actually hold it up to the audience.
And people start walking out of that moment to go watch an old episode of The Simpsons.
But like, The Simpsons is like the reason that I'm like this.
Simpsons predicted everything.
It was a hyper political. Like, The Simpsons is a family sitcom, but it was also an incredibly political show
and prophetic.
Yeah.
It predicted a lot of the stuff that happened. Nish, it's been an absolute pleasure. When you are in the US touring, please come back on the show. We'd love to see you.
I would love to do that. It was an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you all for watching and listening. We're Not Kidding is available on all the places you get your podcasts. Please go check it out. Give us a review. Leave behind positive comments. Tell us how much you love us. And you can watch new episodes of We're Not Kidding as soon as they're published at zeteo.com, YouTube, all over the place. I'm Mehdi Hasan.
I'm Nish Kumar.
And we were not kidding. We're Not Kidding is a Zeteo production. I'm your host, Mehdi Hasan. Today's co-host was Nish Kumar. Our executive producer is Kieran Alvey. Our senior producer and editor is Frank Capello. Our music was composed by Andy Clausen. Our design is by Alicia Tetone. Our mix engineer is Valentino Rivera. And our title animation is by Ehsan Mezghali. Special thanks to Stephen Wenzel for the research.